Good afternoon once again, and thanks for joining us for the KGOU Readers Club. This month we'll be focusing on the book Prize for the Fire, and that is from author Rilla Askew, who's joining me in studio today. Rilla, thanks for being here in person.
My pleasure.
This is not the first time that we have talked about one of your books, but it is the first time we're doing so actually face-to-face here.
Yes.
Now that we're a little bit past the COVID pandemic, I suppose. But good to see you, and Prize for the Fire, that is your latest book?
Yes.
From what I understand, published last year?
Yes, in October of 22.
So this is the second time you're actually joining us on the Readers Club. The first time was for your book Fire in Beulah.
Yes.
When we were doing a series about the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Right, during the centennial year.
That's right. And so you are our first returning guest here on the Readers Club, and I'm sure it won't be the last time. Let's talk about Prize for the Fire, and we're going to get into the actual story here shortly, but I do want to provide just a little bit of context for the listeners, for people who maybe haven't yet read the novel. This takes place in the 16th century.
Yes.
In England, and I think it's helpful for people to have a bit of an idea of what was going on in England during that time wherein the book is set, because some of the things as far as the religion of people in the country and the mandates coming down from the king, those are things that sort of help you understand what's going on in the book. So if you could put the book in just a little bit of context for us, what was happening during this point in history there in England?
So it was the early days of the English Reformation, and it was the era of King Henry VIII. And Henry VIII, during this time, proclaimed himself to be the head of the church. So for centuries, millennia, the Pope in Rome was always considered the head of the church. And so the Reformation was going on in Europe. Martin Luther had already, tacked up his 39 Theses, and that had begun there. But England's Reformation was quite different, and it was really grounded in Henry VIII. And so for people who are Tudor fans or Tudor aficionados, they know about Henry VIII and his 6 wives, and divorced, beheaded, survived. No, divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Those are the 6. And so this would be right around the second one, actually. Or his third wife, Jane Seymour. So this novel takes place from 1537 to 1546, and there were massive changes happening within the Church of England. Most significantly, the translation of the Bible into English. So that had begun with Tyndale in terms of broad distribution of Tyndale's testaments in the Pentateuch. And then the Coverdale Bible became more accessible. But it was still underground. And then during this era, the era that I'm writing about, Henry VIII commissioned what they called the Great Bible. And it was the Chained Bible. It was translated into English, the full scripture of the Christian Bible, and they were these huge tomes that were chained in the churches all over England until Henry changed his mind, which he did many times. So Anne is caught up. Anne Askew in the novel is caught up in this era when it would pull one more directly toward the Reformists and what we would now today call Protestants. They didn't use the term Protestant yet. That didn't really come into common use until really most broadly in Elizabeth's reign, some years later. So it would pull toward what we would call today the Protestant side, and then the pendulum would swing back toward the more traditional, or what we would call today Catholic side. Except that Henry had already, this would be our contemporary understanding of it, but Henry had already proclaimed for himself the role of the head of the church. And so it was already not, as we would call it today, Catholic, because this is what became the Church of England.
And this is because he wanted to be able to divorce
his wife, yes.
So all of this tumult, all these changes just comes from his whims as far as him wanting to be able to
to
change
divorce
wives.
his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and Mary Anne Boleyn, which many people know this story. I wouldn't say that it's not entirely about that, but in terms of what happened within the church in England, how he moved from being the great defender of the faith as Pope Leo, I've forgotten the number, I think the 10th, declared him, when he was early on, when he was much more traditional. But when the Pope would not give him dispensation for an annulment from Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn, he just said, well, no, you're no longer Pope, I am. And that's what he did.
And this causes massive problems for people in England. And I guess before, so the Bible would just be basically for the upper class, only those who could
read Latin. Yes, and really the clergy, and not even gentlemen and so forth. There was the Bible that was called the Vulgate, but it was really not exactly what we think of. And there were differences between that and what we consider now. What many, particularly Americans, consider the King James version of the Bible, which came later. It came after Elizabeth. James was just after Elizabeth, James I, and he's the one who commissioned what we call the King James Bible, and that's the one that came to this continent, and it's the one that many, as I did, grew up with. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, and that was the translation that we used all the time. That's changed a lot, I think, in contemporary Christianity in this country, but for many, many decades, hundreds of years, 450 years, the King James Bible was the Bible that Christian Protestants used in this country. So all of this is a legacy that exists with us today in this country that came from this era of King Henry VIII down through his son, and then his daughter Mary, who swung back toward what we would consider the Catholic side, and then his daughter Elizabeth, who swung back toward the Protestant side. Mm-hmm. So it was a time of great tumult, and it's true that women. Some women were educated. Anne Askew was well educated. She was a gentleman's daughter. She actually knew Latin. She had, studied it. She was not by going to university or to a school, but her father indulged her with tutors, tutors, T-U-T-O-R-S, not right. T-U-D-O-R-S, tutors, right. And this was the intellectual engagement that the possibility that she had was to study Scripture once that English translation became available. So things turned on that, and they turned in terms of interpretation of elements like purgatory, which was not there in that Scripture as translated. Therefore, people who were aficionados of the Scripture, who believed in sola scriptura, only in Scripture is God's truth revealed, would say, well, then there is no purgatory because it's not here.
It doesn't say
penances are not here,
book.
Right?
Yeah.
There, indulgences to get to pray your loved ones out of purgatory. It's not here. So it was revolutionary, and she was just very much caught up with that and a true believer. That's where she put her intellect and her intellectual investigation, her curiosity, and her faith.
And let's be clear here. Anne Askew was a real person.
Yes.
This is not a fictional character that you have made. How much of this novel is true, I guess you would say? Obviously, you're taking some liberties, but Anne was a real person who
yes, she
met
was.
her fate like this.
Yes, and she and we know about her because she was famous in her own time, because she wrote about her trials where she was put on trial largely for denying the doctrine of transubstantiation, so that she in these trials it was punishable. It was a crime punishable by burning to deny the doctrine of transubstantiation, to deny that it is the actual body and blood of Christ in the sacrament. So from her reformist point of view, it was a symbol of the body and blood of Christ, not actually transformed into the literal body and blood of Christ during the Mass. And that was a huge point of contention, so much so that to deny it by the Act of 6 Articles, which was one of the legislative events. I think it's maybe hard for contemporary readers, unless they know a lot about the Reformation, to understand how there was no separation between church and state in that time. Henry was the state and Henry was the church. And so there were priests and men of the clergy and prelates who pulled him one direction, and there were people from the Privy Council who were non-clergy who tried to pull him another direction, and he did sway. He was influenced one direction and then the other from time to time, but finally all authority lay with him. And so this law, the Act of 6 Articles, made it a crime punishable by death to say what Anne said again and again and again in her trials. She would not. I should make it clear. She didn't say this again and again. She skirted it. They asked her again and again and again, and she quoted scripture back to them. She tried very, very hard for a very long time and through many trials to avoid answering.
They plead with her, give us a straight answer,
yeah. And
please.
She would either just look at them and smile, or just shut her mouth, or she would answer them back with scripture.
And so that belief that she had that the communion wafers, the wine, were symbols of Jesus's body and blood, not actually physically his body and blood, is what she ends up, being executed for. Not her attempts to, get her marriage annulled or anything like that. It's this very simple. She could have in any time just said that
it's the real presence,
and they would have let her go.
Yeah.
And
they would have used her as an example.
Yeah.
She would have that would have meant that she recanted, and so they would have used her as an example, but not executed her.
But didn't she believe the way that she did because of the reforms that Henry had brought about in the church? Because it swings back and forth a little bit, right? So, we have this English translation of the Bible that people can now, openly read, and then the king changes his mind and goes back more toward like traditional beliefs, but all the while it's at least implied that it's not really him necessarily making these decisions. It's the people around him, his advisors and things. So where did that belief that she had about the symbolism of the body and blood of Christ come from? Did she not believe that because that was at some point the direction it was going?
It was her interpretation of Scripture. So when he says, when Jesus says, "Take, eat, this is my body," she interprets that to be a symbol. She says back to them at the trial, but he also compares himself to a door. Would you say that Jesus is a door? And so she turns the other times when Jesus uses figurative language within Scripture to support her view. She says, "My God is a spirit and cannot be eaten with teeth." So, but where she came to this belief, we don't know. So this is the imagined part. So that is part of what I work to do in the novel, is to give us the moment where she begins to see things this way. So I've created some fictional elements of the narrative that justify her deep immersion in the Scripture. But historically, we don't know that. What we do know about her. So one other really interesting element of Anne Askew's life is that she was a writer. And she wrote an account of her many trials. And it was published just after her death in a book called The Examinations of Anne Askew. And it was published within 6 months, in two sections within 6 months after her death, and became very, very famous. And it's here where we understand what she believed and what she stood for and what happened to her within those trials. and so it's in a sense a sort of it's not exactly a memoir, but it's the most autobiographical writing that we have from English women writers in that era, and one of the first to be published. Catherine Parr, who was Henry's last wife, also published writings, and some of them were, in a sense, autobiographical, Lamentations of a Sinner, but they were all grounded in religion. And Anne's answers, and she wrote them because of religion, because of her faith, but her answers back and what they asked her, all these trials that she was subjected to, where she was a woman standing alone before this entire tribunal of men of the church and of the Privy Council, the political world, asking her these same questions over and over again. And she answered them out of her faith. So we understand that, but we don't know how she got there. And I think it's difficult or challenging for contemporary readers to understand how religion, how powerful religion was in the lives of everyone in that era in England. There wasn't. If you were agnostic, I don't think you would have told anyone that. There was no way to sort of view the world separate from Christianity in England at that time. So there were nuances about what people believed, but there was not a question about whether the church and Christianity was the fundamental shape of the world.
Yeah, it is. It is difficult as you read this, as someone for who myself personally am not particularly religious. There are times I want to scream at Anne, just tell them what they want to hear.
Yes.
What difference does it make?
Yes.
Get out of there. Yeah. But no, we're talking about our eternal soul here.
Exactly.
And she will never back off
exactly.
of her beliefs. It's the KGOU Readers Club. The book is Prize for the Fire. The author is Rilla Askew, who joins me today in studio. I want to ask you a little bit about why you wrote this novel. The connection seems obvious. Her name is Anne Askew. Your name is Rilla Askew. How did you come to discover her? Why did you write this? Are you related?
Well, how did I come to discover her? My sister, who's obviously also named Askew. Well, maybe not obviously. Some people have siblings have different last names. But my younger sister, Rilla Askew, learned about her. She was a great fan of all things Tudor, particularly Elizabeth and Catherine Parr. And she learned about Anne Askew back when she was in high school. So she told my other sister, Ruth, and I about it when we were probably in our early 20s. So I had known about her. I just didn't know her story. I was mistakenly thought she was a lady-in-waiting to Catherine Parr, but that was actually not the case. And I didn't even know that she had been executed the way that she was. I didn't know her story at all. I just knew she had something to do with the era of King Henry VIII. But I probably in the early 2000s, actually, that long ago, I just began to read more about her and got fascinated with her. So I came to her and became interested in her because we share the same last name, and I had known about her for it seems since my young adult life, but not with any particular passion or interest or intrigue. And then it happened, and I don't really know why, except that I found out more of her story. I found out that she sought a divorce in an era when women were not ever allowed to divorce. Well, no one was allowed to divorce except Henry VIII. And in fact, he wasn't seeking a divorce. They used that term. He was actually seeking an annulment.
As though the marriage was never legitimate in the first place.
Exactly. And she sought this as well. She went to a religious court in Lincoln, and then she went to the political court in London, seeking a divorce, which of course she was never granted. But she took back her own name, her maiden name, because her husband's last name was Kyme, and she was known as Kyme in the early years of her marriage. So those two things, and the fact that she was a writer. She was also a poet. Now, I don't deal with the fact that she wrote poetry or is reputed to have written poetry in the novel for a number of reasons that have to do with narrative faithfulness, in a sense, because the only poem there are two poems actually that are attributed to her. One of them I'm not sure at all she wrote. The other one is possible, but there's no documentation that she actually wrote them, and there are only those two, and they would have been after she had suffered a great deal and was in prison. And so I would have had to make her a poet all the way through the book. I just don't think you become a poet, even no matter how much you've suffered, in the last months of your life. And so I elected to not include that in the novel, but this is given to her. And then the fact that she wrote the examinations of Anne Askew and that they were published, one of the first women to be published, have her writings published in English. It made me fascinated with her. And then as I began to learn more of her life, I became even more intrigued. And did I answer all your questions?
No, I think so. And I want to kind of go through her life, or at least the part of it that we get in the novel there, because, by the end, she is this pretty famous person who's publicly executed. And then, of course, like you say, published a few months later. When we meet her at the beginning of the book, this is not the case at all. What has happened is her sister has recently died, who she just loved to death, and that's a theme throughout. Throughout the book, she's having a dialogue with her deceased sister in many cases, and then so her sister Maddie was supposed to be marrying Master Kime, right? This man, and I must say again, you're very good at writing
bad men,
bad guys.
Yeah.
And this guy is not a very sympathetic character in the book, and you effectively convey that. He was supposed to marry her sister. Her sister dies. Now Anne has to marry this guy that she has absolutely no affection toward whatsoever. In fact, he's just a brute. He's just a bad guy all around. This is where we sort of start with Anne Askew. And she has the audacity to defy him, to eventually seek to, separate from him entirely. But at the beginning of the book, whenever she's at least making some attempt to be what is supposed to be a good wife, because that is what she's commanded to do by Scripture as well.
Yes.
That seems to be about the time that she starts to be defiant in her religious beliefs as well. Were those tied together somehow? Was it out of how much she despised her husband that she would go down to the church and read the Bible out loud while other people gawked at her and things like that? What his influence, I wonder, as far as pushing her in that direction, and if maybe he was a nicer guy, none of this would have happened at all.
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? So I, again, have the freedom of writing a novel, so I have created Thomas Kime's character as you describe him. And we don't know for sure historically if he was like that, but we do know it's historically documented, or it's written, that he violently threw her out of the house. So I have taken that little bit of historical knowledge and enlarged it to make him a domestic abuser. And I think it's also, as it may be difficult to understand today how powerful a force religion was in that time, it's also perhaps equally challenging to understand how powerful the patriarchy was at that time. I mean, women had no rights at all. A woman belonged to her father. She was essentially her father's property until he chose who she would marry. And then she was delivered to her husband, and then she was her husband's property. She couldn't own property of her own. Her dowry all went to her husband. She had no agency. She had no freedoms. She had no means to do anything except to be a submissive wife and to bear children. So now I will say there are certainly historical exceptions, and readers who know the era will know that there are other women who were exceptions to that rule, and sometimes widows could be an exception to that rule. So it's like after you had already been your father's property and then your husband's property, and they were all dead, and then you could become a woman of property yourself and have some influence. But so I took these elements and this understanding of how powerless she was, and employed that to do exactly what you have said. Her freedom was only in religion, only in her surrender to what she considered her God's will, her faith in Scripture, which she took to be the absolute literal translation of God's will and determination here on this earth. And so her defiance of her husband, yes, they are in the novel, they're inextricably linked. But I also made that as a choice for us to begin to understand how she would come to such a place of faith that she would stand in defiance, that she wouldn't say what they wanted her to say when she was put on trial. She was obviously a very courageous young woman. We know that just from reading what she wrote and what she answered back to them. But how she got there was my challenge as a novelist, and it's what I hope to bring the reader along. And so I did use some fictional elements to make that happen. So one of the ways that I do this is that fictionally I have her brother, who was the most religious and the most reformist in his worldviews, bring a copy of the Coverdale Bible and give it to Maddie, her sister Martha, the one who was supposed to marry Thomas Kyme. And she secreted it away in her hope chest, her dowry chest, and Anne finds it after Maddie is gone. And so there's a connection for her between, she actually calls it Maddie's book as opposed to the Bible. So this deep grief and guilt that she feels about her sister pours into this study of Scripture in the novel. Mm-hmm. And so that is created from my imagination.
Sure.
Trying to find a way to create this character who is what many today would consider a religious fanatic. By the end, when she, like you say, she won't hush her mouth, she won't surrender, she won't submit, and all of it is couched in and grounded in her beliefs as they relate to the English translation of the Christian Bible.
It's one of the most sort of gut-wrenching parts of the novel whenever Kyme destroys Maddie's book, mm-hmm. tears all the pages out after she has, for years, kept it hidden away. And mm-hmm. at one point, it was buried out in the pigsty by her servant, and then here's this awful man ripping it to shreds. We hear in the book about people being disemboweled, drawn and quartered, burned alive.
Oh, but they were mean. I'm telling you.
The imagery of him tearing her precious book to pieces like that, it was one of the most powerful parts of it that I thought. And that does bring me to Beatrice and another. You were here before to talk about Fire and Beulah, mm-hmm. other novel, and one of the kind of commonalities that I saw there was this juxtaposition of the servant and the lady of the house. And we mm-hmm. get this again in Prize for the Fire with Beatrice and Anne's relationship. Of course, very different from what we see in Fire and Beulah, because there was really no affection there between the servant and what was her?
Althea.
Yeah.
Graceful. Yeah.
And graceful. Right. But in this there is. Beatrice really cares about Anne, and the feeling is certainly mutual, although there are points in the novel where it does seem like Anne sort of, despite her affection for Beatrice, there's times that she basically sort of forgets her.
Yes.
And she's left out in the street or, otherwise. But Beatrice Was that someone that you took creative license with, or is that a documented person that we knew of who also existed?
Well, her name is fictional. We know she existed. Well, in the first place, a woman of Anne's class would have had a lady's maid. But what we know is that Anne's writings were smuggled out of Newgate Prison by her maid. So that I knew that as part of the historical record, knowing that I wanted that, I needed to have that happen in the book in a way that the reader is really engaged with. So the maid needed to have full dimension. So the character's fully imagined, and in fact, Anne's character novelistically is fully imagined, as all the characters are. But Beatrice, yes, was a real character, and in fact, everyone in the novel was a real historical character. There's only one character that I can think of that I just totally made up and created a name for, and that is the male servant of one of her friends, John Lascelles. Everybody else's name, her brother's birth order, all of those things are historical. So the people who put her on trial, everybody is an historical character, and so is Beatrice. But but their relationship is imagined. But the class system in England, and certainly in that era, is such that I felt a need. It would not make sense to me that Anne would view her maid as an equal, or that the maid would view herself as an equal. No. So in that era, so some of the ways that you're speaking of, Anne's at minimum thoughtlessness. She's very dependent on Beatrice, and she has great affection for her. But there are places where she treats her just like a maid in a way that that are in contemporary minds, and myself personally find really appalling.
Yes. That's interesting that you say that one character that you kind of just totally made up, the servant for
John Lascelles.
For Lascelles, yeah. Because that's where we end the novel, because he's killed as well with Anne, right?
John Lascelles is, yeah. Are we telling the readers too much?
I don't know. We do know, and that is an interesting question as well, because you sort of know by just the description of the book, and this is a historical character, what her fate is eventually going to be. That is not something that is hidden. It's that journey to get to that point. That's the interesting part. And, we don't spend a lot of time in the novel going through the actual description of, her execution itself. We see it coming. And then when it passes, we see the two servants, Beatrice and Jack. Yeah. They don't know what to do at that point. They've lost both of the people that they've basically devoted their lives to. But I think, and that also made, as far as reading the novel, knowing what's going to happen at the end. We know what her fate's going to be. But you wonder all along the way, how are we going to actually get there? There are portions of it, as I'm reading, well, this is because she's, defying her husband. She's seeking to annul the marriage. But that does not end up really being why she was put to death at the end of the day. So I don't know. Are we telling people too much with this interview, other than that Anne Askew meets a bad end at the end of the novel?
And it's why she was famous, yeah. and it's why her writings were published. And so I think that's not giving too much away, because I think if we read, for instance, about Joan of Arc, we know. And so much has been written in plays and poetry and novels and, of course, nonfiction. We know what her end is, but what we're fascinated with is how she got there and what happened with her on that journey. And I think it's the same thing with this novel, and that's why we want to read it. We to understand, and it's why I wanted to write it. I very often with a novel, I have a question before me. that I want to know. So when I was working on Fire in Beulah, for instance, one of the questions I had before me was, why did that happen here? Why did the worst, most massive assault by white Americans on black Americans happen in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, Oklahoma specifically, in the former Indian Territory? And the whole novel is an investigation of that. How could that happen here? With this book, what I wanted to know was what makes someone believe something so much that they're willing to be burned alive for it. Now, we know in this particular, in our current era, there are people who believe something so much that they're willing to die for it or to kill for it. That is, it's not something I understand intellectually or emotionally. I understand it, with knowledge, but not on the inside. So that was my journey as a writer, was to try to find my way to understanding that for Anne. And because you're right, it seems, at least from any of the historical record that's come down, she never flinched, she never blinked, she never recanted, she stood her ground, even knowing what that meant. And that's phenomenal to me. And it also means that for me as a writer, I was thinking she's essentially what I would call a religious fanatic. If we were to put her into this era, that's what I would say about her. So how do I write about that in a way that makes her deeply human for the reader? How do I write about that in a way that makes us sympathetic to someone who, fortunately she wasn't willing to kill for it, but she was willing to die for it. How do I make that real for a 21st century reader?
You certainly do an effective job of it, I must say. It's the KGOU Readers Club. The book is Prize for the Fire. I'm Logan Layden, and I've got Rilla Askew, who is the author of the book Prize for the Fire, with me this hour. It is that journey. There are points in the novel where you wonder, what is Anne going to eventually do that causes her to come to the bad end that she receives at the end of the book? Because at some point she rises quite high. She's in the Queen's court, right? And that's Catherine Parr, right? So she's brought in with the ladies of the Queen's court to translate scripture for them. And at that point you think, well, she's part of really high society now. How is her downfall going to happen? And why didn't they intervene? It's really cool for me to be able to talk, read these books and then talk to the authors and pepper them with questions that I have. Couldn't have Catherine Parr
done something?
Did she not like Anne? I thought she did. Or was that just not something that rose to the Queen's level of, maybe she didn't even know it was happening?
Well, you bring up something really interesting, and I don't know if this is as readily available in the novel as it might be if I were able to leave Anne's story more and go look at Catherine Parr's story, which I felt that I could not. It was Catherine Parr that they were after. So the people who put Anne on trial, that continued to bring her up on these charges, that in fact finally tortured her, they were using her as a path to get to Catherine Parr. And so it's really, in the novel, it's really embedded, but I think that people who understand the era understand pretty well that one of the reasons things were so hard on Anne Askew is because the people who were Stephen Gardner and Richard Rich and Thomas Risley, so people who read the Hilary Mantel novels or people who are very familiar, even A Man for All Seasons, Richard Rich was the one who betrayed Thomas More. So these are, again, real historical characters, and they were absolutely after Anne, but Anne was not their primary goal. Catherine Parr was. So Catherine Parr was not in a position to stand up for her, nor were her brothers. And her brothers were also really well placed, some at court, and her eldest brother was already a knight in Lincolnshire, and they all were in danger of the same fate themselves, or worse, being accused of treason and so forth. I mean, the era was so filled with destruction, and if you were on the wrong side of that, then your head was forfeit, or perhaps burning was reserved for women and for heretics, and traitors were hung, drawn, and quartered. Mm-hmm. So the punishments, the public executions were just horrific in that era, and so nobody would stand for her because they did not want to be in danger themselves, because what could happen to them would be the same thing that happened to Thomas Cromwell and Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard.
And she does put her family in a pretty difficult situation. Not talking about Kime, who cares what happens to that awful guy, but her brothers, Francis in particular, she does put him in a pretty difficult spot. He's forced eventually to hide her on his estate, and the king's men come and search the whole place and eventually find out that, yes, she is there. Like, he could have been killed as easily.
And he knew that. And he knew that. And so historically, what we do know is that he did betray her. He told them. So that is not, I mean, that's in the novel as well. But again, it's an historical accuracy. And years later, it is said his nephew wrote about the fact that for decades later, he was racked with guilt, and that he would see basically ghost fires in his room. It's almost like he went mad afterwards. Although he lived a prosperous many years afterwards, but that's just another interesting historical fact.
Yeah, and you feel for him. And there are times as we go through the novel, as I read it, at least as I read it, that there are times where I do get a little frustrated with Anne. It's like, look at the danger you're putting everyone in.
Yes.
And, don't you want, she's got children. She's got children who she loves. And don't you want to see them again? Just say the piece of bread is Jesus' body, and you can go and be with your family. Although, I mean, she doesn't have any desire at all to go back to the Kime estate. But there's so many opportunities. They almost seem like they don't want to have to end up executing her. Like,
I think that's probably true. And in the ultimate event, her martyrdom became a real political problem for Henry, but he only had 6 months more to live, as a matter of fact. So,
and Elizabeth Parr was his last.
Catherine Parr,
Catherine Parr was his last wife. And she outlives him. She outlives him.
So divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. She's the one who survived him. Not for very long, actually. She went ahead and married the first love of her life, Thomas Seymour. Probably, I think, an embarrassingly short period of time after Henry died, and then she died in childbirth, as so many women did in that era.
Just the whole. Seems like a terrible time to
be a woman.
Alive,
I'm telling you,
to be a woman in particular, but to even be anyone during this.
And the plague and the sweating sickness, and it was a hard, harsh era.
I do want to ask a little bit about King Henry's relationship to all of this, because we hear about him some in the novel almost as a kind of a background sort of character. We hear some about him, his stinking, rotting legs, and it was him who pushed forward these changes in the religion. Did he know of Anne Askew? Did he have any idea who this was or what was happening around it?
This is a controversy, and I think it's not actually known. And so there are historians who will talk about it from one side and then the other. And my personal belief is that he did know what. I don't think that the ones who tortured her would have done that if they didn't think that that's exactly what the king wanted them to do. So and she was so famous. She was famous before she was taken into custody. She was what they call a gospeler. So she was almost like a street preacher. She interpreted and told the gospel to people who couldn't read for themselves all across London. So there was this really rich and teeming underground evangelical community that was happening in London at that time. And she was a big part of it, and she was a very famous gospeler. So that was also there was that. She had left her husband, she had left her children. She took back her own name. She was educated. She did all the things that a woman was not supposed to do. So she was already had their attention and under fire. But Henry, nothing happened in Henry's kingdom that he didn't direct in some way or another. So in the novel, in the early drafts, I wrote many passages of Henry because he's so fascinating, and because everything that happened to her happened because of Henry VIII. There was no way to separate what was happening politically to her life.
That is another thing that is so confounding as we look on it from the perspective of the 21st century. Despite all that, like you just said, everything that was happening to Anne, including her eventual death, happened under King Henry VIII, and most likely, as you say, with his blessing or authorization. Yet she never loses faith in the king. She has a lot of faith in King Henry. Does she not?
She does. She believed that he was, she believed that again, it's hard for us to imagine the divine right of kings, that believing that God had willed Henry to reign over England.
So he must be good.
Yes. And he brought the English Bible. He brought the Great Bible. So she, as many others, before he pulled it back, and made a law that said, nobody below the level of gentry and no woman could read the Bible. And then they finally amended that to say, well, women of the level of gentry and above could read it, but they had to do it by themselves alone and couldn't read it in public. And, of course, that's what she was doing all over London, was reading it and quoting it because she knew a prodigious amount of Scripture aloud in public. So she was carrying the gospel.
But she always said that she didn't defy any of the actual rules. Like, she'd go to the church and read the Bible, but she would do it quietly, on her
silently,
own.
To herself.
Yeah, as people like gawked at her. Now, eventually, she was going into these underground meetings and actually doing, basically acting almost like a preacher herself, right?
Which also a woman couldn't do, and still, and in some denominations still can't today. It's truly, when you begin to study the English Reformation, and particularly the early English Reformation, you can really see how so much of that was carried to this continent and still permeates people's faith today, our politics today. It's really stunning how the legacy of that era has come down to us. But yes, you're right. His will, the king's will, shaped everything for all of England, but especially was for someone who became prominent as she did and got the king's eye on them, and that was a very, very dangerous thing. Not just for women, for anyone, unless you had him on your side. So the early drafts of the novel had many versions of Henry from the inside. What was happening in his life parallel with hers. But the novel would have been one of those 800-page novels if I'd left Henry in. And plus, he is so fascinating, and all of the backstory of he goes through at least 3 wives during the years that this novel is set. It would take the focus away from Anne. So ultimately, I took those passages out. And I think the book is stronger for it because I think that Henry was so powerful and so seductive by his, narcissism and his megalomania and his absolute brute force that it would diminish Anne's story. So yes, she was shaped by him. My personal belief, and I don't know that it comes there so much in the novel, It's there in the prologue. But my personal belief is that she would begin to doubt Henry. You know, for her, it was still all about the Scripture. That's where her faith lay. And since, although really she sent a plea to him from prison after she had already been condemned, but no one knows if it ever reached him. Probably it did not.
And they never actually crossed paths themselves, at least as far as we know. In the book, the closest we get is she tries desperately to see him as he's, coming down the street, but doesn't actually get to. They never had any actual interactions with each other.
Not that we know of historically either.
It's KGOU Readers Club. The book is Prize for the Fire. I'm Logan Layden. I've got the author, Rilla Askew, with me for just a few more minutes this afternoon. And as always, when I get this opportunity to talk to authors about these books that they've written, I want to know what happened to people afterwards. As we end the story, whatever her kids. Do you know what happened to them? Where did
we don't know. Yeah. So people ask me if I'm descended from Anne Askew, and I say I don't know, but I believe her children would have been named Kime. So if they survived, their name would not have been Askew in any case. So I, that we don't know. But historically, we don't know what happened to her children. They're in fact, from the histories I've read, they're not even sure which Thomas Kime she was married to. Everybody was named Thomas in those days. There were so many Thomases. Yes. Just as many Thomases as there were Elizabeths, and Catherines. But so they don't know if she was married to this Thomas Kime or that Thomas Kime, and they don't know what happened to her children. So some people conjecture that they didn't survive childhood. Her brother survived, and she had in fact a nephew that probably was born. I don't know if he was born after she was executed, but was the next generation who became an historian, as a matter of fact. And so there's evidence of nephews and other descendants coming from their family, and her brother Francis lived to a ripe old age and died wealthy.
Having this conversation with you and being able to kind of put the book in that historical context a little more is certainly helpful to me. I don't know that much about Tudor England.
Well, you do. You know more now.
But I know more now than I did before. That's for sure. Rilla Askew, thanks for joining me today. The book is Prize for the Fire. I'm KGOU Managing Editor Logan Layden. This has been the KGOU Readers Club. And if you missed any of today's discussion, tune in Sunday at noon. That's when we'll have an encore broadcast of this hour's program. This is KGOU, your NPR source.